Isn't it weird how you can land in a group with an ultimate legend or something and they play, well, not like a legend? You land in a dungeon with a player with a big mentor crown, yet it seems like they have no idea what they're doing. Someone has all the best equipment but seemingly doesn't know how to use it. You see a player that has beaten Palace of the Dead solo, so they have the Necromancer title, but they are terrible at playing that job. How do these things happen? Well, there are different reasons for that, and I want to talk a bit about them all to defend some of these players, but also to highlight that these kinds of quote-unquote titles don't necessarily mean that a player knows what they're doing. So let's start with the biggest one. Having a legend title, for example, or an item from the current raid tier means that you beat that content, obviously. However, having beaten that content only really says something about your skill in that content with the job you used. Meaning that having a title does not equate to general skill in Final Fantasy XIV. I know some of you will start to object to this, but let me be clear, it is possible to be skilled at Final Fantasy XIV, and then also have a title for beating difficult content. It is a lot more likely that this is the case, which is why we'd assume most of the people that have a big fancy Savage raid weapon or a legend title would be great at the game in general. However, everyone has to start somewhere, and just because you're incredible at DPSing as Summoner in top doesn't mean that you're also equally skilled at tanking as a Gunbreaker in Hallminster Switch. The kind of skills you need to be exceptional at doing an ultimate are not exactly the same you need to be exceptional at doing a random dungeon. Obviously, you don't need as exceptional skills in a dungeon, however, directly applying your skills from an ultimate doesn't always work. Which is why you can be excellent and beat an ultimate without actually being very good at the game outside of that specific ultimate. You might be incredible at raids without being particularly great in your daily expert roulettes. In other words, clearing content does not equate to general skill. But general skill is often something someone who has cleared difficult content will also possess. But as one does not equate to the other, means that there is a very real possibility that some people beat an ultimate but have no idea how to efficiently beat a random dungeon. Another perspective to this particular situation is that while a player who is capable of beating an ultimate might be capable of doing that when they give it 110% in this content where it is necessary, it is however also possible for a player who does such difficult content to not actually care about giving it 110% in a random quote-unquote casual content. Which is alright, but it does give this impression that they are bad rather than they are maybe just not giving it everything they have. There's also the possibility that they deem this easier content beneath them to such a degree that they outright choose to not actually put in any effort, although this is very rare. And the significantly shadier perspective to this is that anything can be bought with money. You might then say, but wait, you can't just beat an ultimate with only 7 players. But then again, who said the person who got the title was playing? This is what gives rise to the PayPal legends. If you can buy anything, even if illegally, it means that it is possible that someone bought a clear of something that is actually really supposed to be hard, given that, again, even though illegal, people buy and sell accounts. It is even possible that someone legitimately beat the ultimate, but then the account was traded to someone who isn't that good. There's a reason why they bought it, presumably. I do want to be clear that this should be the most unlikely scenario, so I think it is for the best to assume people actually legitimately got their titles, given the previously mentioned arguments. For perhaps a real-life example, imagine it like seeing someone jogging down the street. Maybe they have the most expensive shoes and gear to do this in the most effective way possible. Who knows? That doesn't mean that they're good at it, even though they could be. It could be a professional athlete running, and you'd assume they would be good at it, right? But they don't need to give it 110% on this random jog, so they're not. These two examples should somewhat relate. One of them bought the best stuff, but that can never compensate for their lack of fitness or skill if they do lack that. The other has the skill, but isn't in performance mode right now. So what this means when you meet someone with a fancy title in random content is if they're not matching up to the skill level you'd expect from that title, then maybe they are learning something new. Maybe they're having an off day, or maybe it's something else. But you can't assume someone is actually incredible at the game without, seeing them be incredible at the game. Another thing to add to this in the other direction is that as beating hard content itself requires that you can perform your rotation right and do the mechanics right, that means that if you can do that, you don't need to understand why. Meaning, technically, you could master the rotation of whatever job you play to the point necessary to beat the content, without ever understanding why you do the things you do in the order you do them. You can come to understand that crit is the best stat in the game without understanding why. These things are things you'd have to learn by digging deeper, and might not just reveal themselves to you by playing enough. Which is to say that, just because someone has a fancy title, doesn't mean they actually know why they do what they do, even if they have displayed general skill at the game. I've met people with legend titles that never considered that sprinting before entering combat lets you have more sprint duration due to the duration being doubled outside of combat. I've met people with legend titles that don't actually know how crit is the best stat, they just know it is, and it has something to do with double dipping or quadratic scaling or something. I have met legends that think direct hit is outright bad for healers and tanks, very rare, because it doesn't help defensively, and they've managed because the power difference isn't big enough to cause problems with this preference. They might also use this accomplishment of beating an ultimate to further cement themselves in this belief being true. And it might not even be about the things I just listed. The point is that these achievements, which don't actually say anything about your outright knowledge of the game mechanics necessarily, are being used as badges of quality when they don't mean that. Again, you'd assume that someone with a legend title would have deeper knowledge of the game's mechanics. But it is equally possible they don't, but just have what they see, and that turns out to be good enough to follow the strategy. Which then leads us to the biggest of these kinds of problems, the Mentor Crown. Acquiring the Mentor Crown does not require any display of skill whatsoever. It can be acquired eventually simply by playing the game. You might argue that a bad player will never receive enough commendations, but some players give out commendations randomly. You have to remember that you have a weekly challenge to give out a set number of commendations, so some players will just give a commendation to whoever's left in a dungeon. As such, all parts of the Mentor Crown task list is achievable through playing the game at any skill level. This means that having the Mentor Crown does not equate to you knowing anything at all whatsoever about how to play the game effectively. However, you'd hope that the player that does have it has accumulated some general level of skill and understanding of the game on the way there. But, just like with the other things I mentioned, this is something you can only be sure of when the mentor has displayed that they have that knowledge and that skill. Because the Mentor Crown itself does not require these traits to actually obtain. This is why I find it quite fascinating when I've seen players suggest that the Mentor Crown should be locked behind beating a Savage raid synced, or the current one even, or even beat an ultimate. Because the kinds of skills a mentor should have are probably more like teaching skills mainly, which you don't learn by doing Savage raiding or an ultimate. You might obtain these skills by doing it as a side effect, or you might have learned these things on the side while doing it. But doing hard content does not give you the skills to teach other players well. That comes separately. Which is of course also why we have the so-called Burger Crown term, which refers to a mentor who isn't really a mentor, but just in it for the rewards. It gets even funnier when you see such a mentor with a legend title, which does sometimes happen. And with these examples spelled out, I hope you can already see exactly why the titles don't actually mean implied skill when I propose the final example. Having the Necromancer title, which is awarded for beating Palace of the Dead floor 200 solo, does not mean that they're good at any content aside from Palace of the Dead and presumably other deep dungeons. In fact, there's a reasonable chance that they might be less skilled at playing in a team, given that they might have spent a lot of their time playing alone. But that once again assumes, just like with all the other examples, that the only achievement that they have to offer is the Necromancer title. They probably played party content with other players outside of this, but it probably makes more sense here to assume that a Necromancer title holder might not be exceptional at dungeons in a group, or a savage raid for that matter, given that their achievement doesn't say anything about that. But, just like with the other cases, there's a reasonable chance to assume they accumulated some general skill as a result of the difficult achievement, even if it is not guaranteed. And again, similarly, they might also have accumulated some general skill in the game unrelated to doing Palace of the Dead. So to summarize, having a difficult to obtain title or achievement or item doesn't mean that someone would know the ins and outs of what it takes to get this. It doesn't mean that the player is skilled at everything in the game, or knows everything in the game. It does, however, display that the player has the skills necessary to beat that content, assuming they did it themselves. As such, you cannot assume someone is excellent until they prove it for you. Having a time-consuming title, achievement, or item similarly doesn't say anything about skill, and in fact gives even less reason to assume that they are actually good, given that this achievement only required time invested to obtain. As such, you cannot assume they're excellent until they prove it for you. This is also why when someone gets technical about things in the game, it is best to prove it instead of just saying source : trust me bro, because unless the person knows that you know what you're talking about, they can't trust you to know. Legend title, Mentor crown, Necromancer title, Savage weapon, or what have you notwithstanding, especially because you don't even know how they got that. Now that is all for this video, thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, there's a lot of players in Final Fantasy XIV who, get this, simply collect titles, achievements, and items because they like them, and don't actually use them to try and lord over other players with the presumed skill that these things imply. However, these players can sometimes be easy to forget about since they tend to be more quiet about the achievements they accumulated. Isn't that incredible?